let's go ahead and get started. And I'd like to welcome you and say good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. And we'd like to welcome you to our second session on discerning the mind of Christ, slow wisdom in the local and wider church. If you were able to attend our session last Friday, welcome back. If not, we'd be happy to send you a recording of the session. And we welcome you all here today as we discuss discerning the mind of Christ in the wider church. So this session, you might know, is hosted jointly by three organizations. The Center for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College in the UK, which has a few representatives today, including Dr. Alan Carey and Reverend Dr. Ruth Moriarty. Georgetown College in the USA, represented by Dr. Derek Hatch, and the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies in Canada, which I represent, and I'm Melody Maxwell. In our first session last week, we discussed Ruth Moriarty's research on slow wisdom, and this will be a helpful background for us as we go into today's session. So Ruth identified 6 marks of discerning the mind of Christ. And those, which I'm putting in the chat, were slowness, prayer, listening to members, hearing members' contributions, seeking consensus, and prophetic participation. And so in this session, we're going to build on her ideas as we look beyond the local church to Baptist unions and conventions, as well as ecumenical relationships. And so how's the session going to go today? We're going to have 2 presenters followed by a respondent. So we'll have first Dr. Derek Hatch, Professor of Religion and Endowed Chair of Baptist Studies at Georgetown College, and he'll discuss discerning the mind of Christ with those of other denominations. Then we'll have Reverend Dr. Spencer Boersma, who's Associate Professor of Theology at Acadia Divinity College, to discuss discerning the mind of Christ on the union or convention level. And after that, we'll hear a response from Reverend Canon Dr. Gale Richards, postdoctoral research fellow with the Center for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College. So we'll have these speakers and respondent, and then we'll break up into small groups to discuss how what we've heard applies to our own contexts. And then we'll return to the large group to share our insights together. So I hope it is a profitable time for us all and that we listen and learn and then share. So I'm going to turn things over then to Derek to give our first presentation.
Can you all see the slide? So thank you, Melody. And thank you to everyone for being here today. And I'm grateful for the invitation to speak this morning. It's morning in the United States. So last week we discussed the nature of slow wisdom, the Baptist practice of discernment that animates and guides the church business meeting. Our conversation I found particularly insightful, especially as it relates to the ways in which local Baptist congregations operate, or perhaps better, should operate. The opening presentations by Ruth Moriarty, Melody Maxwell, and Roger Jasper gave plenty of fuel for reflection. I've been thinking about that the last week, actually, in some really fruitful ways. The responses and discussion afterward touched on practical concerns about how to implement slow wisdom, a realism concerning when slow wisdom does not happen as it ought, and shared encounters across related yet distinct contexts in the United States, Canada, and the UK. And I'll just echo what Melody has already said. If you were unable to be present last week, I hope you've been able to review the recording. It's really beneficial, I think. Moriarty's claim that slow wisdom is a distinctly Baptist practice, one that she says is critical to Baptist identity and practice. This means that Baptists should embrace it at every level of meeting, including those outside the church. This is the focus of today's discussion, and for my part, I want to explore how slow wisdom resonates with and is quite useful in ecumenical engagement between Baptists and their Christian neighbors. And if it was not already obvious, I'm offering these reflections as a Baptist within the United States, so I welcome contributions, both your insights and your experiences from both the Canadian and UK contexts. It's possible that it's just a silly American thing that's happening here, and we Americans need to be told that things are silly and that the world doesn't revolve around us. So by all means, tell us that. So Melody said this already, but I'd already written it down. So I'm going to go over just some things about slowism that I think are going to be helpful as we lead into the conversation about ecumenism. But some of this will be uh, repeated as long as that slide switches. There it goes. There are some particular aspects of slowism that are important to remember as we reflect on ecumenism. The time-consuming nature of this practice allows for all members to be heard and consensus agreement to be sought. At our best, we see a Baptist conviction that the church is the priesthood of all believers under the lordship of Christ. This conviction then gives rise to a call to the church to embrace the breadth of its members' voices as part of discerning the mind of Christ. Slow wisdom highlights the importance of a gathered church that discerns the mind of Christ together. A crucial facet of Baptist history, and one that even when we read Baptist history, we see that even Baptists meeting together in the early years of Baptist life was seen as subversive and dangerous to the standing order churches of those centuries. There's an oft neglected emphasis here on embodiment that plays a crucial role in the discernment that occurs in these gatherings. Practical matters, though no less theological, are found here as well. Congregational church polity is often described as democratic in shape. This is very commonly said in the United States. And the use of parliamentary rules of procedure, whether Robert's Rules of Order or something else entirely, might be seen as a sign of good discussion and discernment. While these models do allow for efficient and orderly consideration of church business, the procedure usually leads each item for business to termination in a vote. Sometimes a vote hastily taken, and sometimes with a significant plurality of the congregation on the losing end. As Moriarty points out in her book and in our discussion last week, this is not the Baptist ideal. Those gathered together share in decision making because Christ, rather than the voting congregation, is the head of the church, both cosmically and locally. Moriarty is helpful in reminding us that the purpose of the Baptist church meetings is to discern the mind of Christ through the members of the church meeting, not to express a democratic majority. Solidarity, generosity, and listening to the Spirit mark this sort of discernment and cannot be upheld by simply voting. As she points out, listening to prophetic voices within the congregation, a community, is in fact more difficult when voting is the ultimate focus. So turning our attention to ecumenism and the practices of ecumenical exchange, there are some clear points of intersection here. The past 30 years have seen significant developments in how ecumenical dialogues are pursued, from differentiated consensus, which is where dialogue partners name both their agreements, as well as ongoing disagreements. The idea here is that clarifying disagreements is as important as moving toward agreement, which has produced some really rich ecumenical reports in recent years. To receptive ecumenism as another way of pursuing ecumenical dialogue, where dialogue partners look for gifts from the other that might answer questions raised by one's own denomination or tradition. Moreover, there have been examples of cross-denominational interactions at the local level that have been new and insightful. And I want to briefly discuss how each of these types of ecumenical encounter can be enhanced by the practice of slow wisdom. So we'll kind of take these in two different ways, talking about formal ecumenical dialogues on the one hand and local practices on the other. And admittedly, I'm going to say more about the first than the second, but I think our conversation will fill in the second really well. So I'm really hoping that's a place where some of our conversation will kick in with the local possibilities. Formal ecumenical dialogues are one avenue of ecumenical exchange, and they have become quite common since the mid-20th century. Many denominations, including Baptists, have pursued bilateral and multilateral dialogues and conversations at the national and international level. While having a group of select people gather to discuss how two or several denominations will relate to one another might seem detached from the local setting, there is still a dynamic within the dialogue that is particularly insightful for our conversation about slow wisdom. Members of a dialogue commission designate a period of time to gather together in a more immersive way. For example, in the recently completed third phase of dialogue between the Baptist World Alliance and the Roman Catholic Church, participants gathered on 5 different occasions during a 6-year period. This is from 2017 to 2022. There was a pause in 2020 and an adaptation in 2021 due to COVID. Each gathering was 1 week in length and involved more than simply discussing the theological matters on the agenda. Members prayed together. They ate together. They actually lived in the same building together. and stayed together. They experienced new locations and cultures together as they often met in different places around the world. They had an audience with the Pope together. In short, they shared that week of life together. And they did so to such an extent that over the course of the dialogue's 6 year span, they grew to know one another as friends. In other words, while the first year involved getting to know one another, where everybody was new and you perhaps did not know anybody, subsequent years involved checking in and catching up on life. Sorry. Catching up on life, including their families, vocational shifts and employment changes, and new and ongoing health concerns as well. This description resonates with Moriarty's discussion of slow wisdom as precisely that, slow. It takes time to know each other in this manner, both the momentary encounters and the span of time that characterizes the relationship. Moreover, these encounters are embodied, involving shared life together for that set period of time. Finally, commission members prayed together both prior to each day's session and afterward, with leadership for these prayers alternating between a Baptist and Catholic commission member. Moriarty has indicated that prayer is a crucial aspect of discernment, shaping the conversation at the outset, marking the slowness of deliberation. For instance, when somebody might say that more prayer is needed about a particular issue before they can come to a decision, that's not just a sort of placeholder. That's saying that they need to pray about it more in the midst of the discernment. And prayer is involved in testing the discerned conclusion. Likewise, these ecumenical conversations are also saturated with prayer, framing the discussion and yet doing much more than just that. The actual conversations, which in the most recent Baptist Catholic dialogue have concerned theological and social ethical topics, center on generous interaction that does not avoid disagreement. In fact, one recent philosophical shift within ecumenical dialogue is that naming disagreements is not the enemy of consensus. In reality, clarifying points of divergence can help move the conversation forward together and even help the members of each represented tradition to better understand themselves as well as their neighbors. Members also take time to talk about what the conversation topics, not only in formal sessions and discussions, but in informal spaces, dining halls, city streets, restaurants, taxi cabs, rideshare cars, and a bunch of other places where the conversation overflows into the other spaces where they are sharing life together. Very little, if any, voting takes place, in fact. Instead, consensus is the goal, and solidarity is the good to be preserved, meaning that those who disagree are able to walk together with the group, even if they were not entirely on board. And in fact, I'll add here that even if something they don't come to consensus, then they know that they are opening the door for future rounds of conversation that can take more time and see where the conversation continues to go. So again, the slowness is kind of uh, seen here. Further, while there is a great deal of discussion that happens with the whole commission, it is not unusual to use small groups to discuss a particular question or to divide multiple topics. These groups might take more than the allotted session time in order to properly discuss the assigned topic. A lot of late night conversations, for instance, a lot of drafting things and redrafting things in the midst of time. It's a quite full week in some ways, but yet uh, it's methodical and practical and patient at the same time. These groups might take, oh, I said that already. As important as the time taken is that this method is more inclusive, as it brings more voices to the surface of the conversation and often brings new insights to the topic and focus. There can be some new ways of phrasing things and approaching topics that come because a member was more comfortable speaking in a small group, and then that becomes part of that group's contribution to the whole, and it wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for the small group method that was used. We can see at least two significant things occurring in these encounters. First, the issue at hand is being discussed, clarified, and further understood. That is, the task of the commission is moving forward. But secondly, each delegation is recognizing Christ in each other and tacitly acknowledging that the Christ found in the other does not necessarily take the same shape as the Christ found in their own group. Indeed, Baptists should be particularly attuned to this sort of discernment in Christ's presence. Here, the final paragraph of the report from the second phase of dialogue between the Baptist World Alliance and the Roman Catholic Church. This was from 2006 to 2010. This is the last paragraph. What can we say at the end? We hope that the koinonia, or the fellowship or communion, that we have experienced together in worship and discussion will be extended in the life of our communions of faith. Though it may not be enough for those who want more, we can at least say that we each discern in each other's communion characteristics of the Church of Christ, because we can recognize there the presence of Jesus Christ, the Lord of the Church. We hope that this kind of mutual acknowledgement may have an effect at local levels of Baptist and Catholic churches in their life and mission, beyond the rarefied heights of theological conversations. In the local congregations and parishes, may this discernment of Christ in each other be echoed. May Christ, the Word of God, continue to guide, correct, and renew us according to his word. Notice that what is highlighted is the fellowship experienced in both worship and discussion. It's not one or the other. It's not the discussion itself. It's the connection between the two in some ways. The Commission identifies this as crucial for genuine ecumenical encounter, and they encourage Baptists and Catholics at the local level to find opportunities for similar sorts of encounter. But where might these encounters be found? For ecumenism to truly take hold, local participation and reception is necessary. Churches will need to find ways to engage ecumenical documents and build the sort of relationships with Christian neighbors described by Commission members in formal dialogue. And there are several types of local ecumenical encounter worth mention, and like slow wisdom, they all take time to develop. First, local ecumenical partnerships involve formal agreement where several churches decide to exist as a single congregation within a locality. And while this is very rare in the United States, over 100 congregations within the Baptist Union of Great Britain are part of an LEP. And perhaps some folks in attendance today have personal experience, both the successes and the challenges uh, of working within a local ecumenical partnership. Further, we might add that local ecumenical cooperation could also keep existing congregations distinct while pursuing more engagement, collaboration, and partnership with Christian neighbors from other denominations. To do this well, though, will require genuine listening to the other. The Baptist gift of discernment within a community can be offered to these interactions. Here, using small groups in order to draw in every voice will be important. Ecumenical exchange sounds daunting when the extent of divisions within the body of Christ is recognized. It really can be sort of overwhelming. By contrast, though, a simple invitation to talk together with several local Christians from another denomination is not only easier to accept, but is in fact a central part of the quest for Christian unity. And I hope that we can say more about what that might look like in our local settings. Now, even though this isn't my assigned task, it seems it's strange. I'm going to turn our attention to local conventions and unions and just say a couple of brief words real fast. And it might seem strange to have had this paper go to talk about ecumenical conversations and then come back to conventions and unions and associations. But in some ways, we may have an easier time engaging in some situations with our non-Baptist Christian neighbors than our Baptist brothers and sisters. The recent past has plenty of examples of Baptists ending partnerships with other Baptists, threatening to create new and rival Baptist groups, or even simply distrusting fellow Baptists with whom they disagree. And this is, I'll say, particularly evident in my context in the United States. To be sure, Baptist life has always centered on the local gathered congregation, but associating together outside of the local church has Baptist roots as deep as Congregationalism. The 1644 London Confession of Faith states, although the particular congregations be distinct in several bodies, every one a compact and knit city in itself, yet are they all to walk by one and the same rule, and by all means convenient to have the counsel and help of another in all needful affairs of the church, as members of one body in the common faith under Christ their only head. Similarly, the Abingdon Association, sort of an earlier Baptist association, declared in their first general meeting in 1652 that because there is the same relation betwixt the particular churches each towards other, as there is betwixt particular members of one church, wherefore we conclude that every church ought to manifest its care over other churches, as fellow members of the same body of Christ in general, do rejoice and mourn with them according to the law of their near relation in Christ. Altogether, this means that local congregations are not entirely separate from one another. and that their relations with one another are part of what it means to be church. As important as the local church is to Baptists, the church is larger than the local congregation. Christ is Lord of the church in the local gathering, so he is Lord of the church in the translocal gathering of those gatherings. In ecumenical encounters, whether in a dialogue or an opportunity that for shared witness, we know that our partners are different from us. That is not news to us. But we strive to find ways forward, ideally by recognizing Christ in the other, articulating and clarifying agreements and disagreements, committing to take time for further interaction. About ecumenical exchange, Moriarty writes, fostering dialogue between partners expands the slow wisdom approach of listening to each other and highlights the responsibility to accept differences within the church and a commitment to learn from them in the pursuit of unity. This approach is also particularly useful for diverse groups of Baptist churches who are bound together in fellowship within an association, a convention, or a union, and yet sometimes have difficulty walking forward together. We might recognize Christ in the other, clearly state agreements and disagreements while not viewing disagreement as an exit sign or signal to head to the door, and commit to shared life together. Moreover, like the ecumenical dialogues, perhaps refraining from voting as much as possible is a crucial step as well. Baptists have a history as dissenters, which could indicate that we are uniquely ready or should be ready to attend to the minority, but our experience is sometimes quite different. A helpful reminder is that prophetic voices often come from the margins, which means that when I am in the majority, those in the minority might be key to understanding the mind of Christ and bearing witness to Christ in the wider world. Admittedly, this is much easier said than done. But as we discussed last week, for Baptists, the practical wisdom that is Christian discernment only occurs within the gathered people of God. This embodied knowledge is time-consuming, but it is also life-giving. Our unions and conventions seem to be places where these practices of slow wisdom have been forgotten or simply not utilized. Like many church business meetings, the focus is on making a decision for practical or financial reasons rather than discerning the mind of Christ within this larger gathering. So what would it mean for larger Baptist meetings and associations and conventions and unions to embrace slow wisdom? How might power be discentered through embodied practices such as small groups? How might we find a way for deliberations to be more time-consuming in a life-giving manner? What prophetic word might be received within conventions and unions if all voices are included and heard? Like ecumenism, to walk this path together might help us find a much larger sense of the church. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. We appreciate hearing from you. And now we look forward to hearing from Spencer, who will discuss discerning the mind of Christ on the union or convention level.
All right. I will have to talk about the local church and the denomination kind of together, but can help but do that. Well, how do I begin this? And how do I think about this? There is a book by Will and Ian Ferguson entitled How to Be Canadian. It is a satirical take on Canadian culture, everything from sports to driving to food to romance. I have been known to gift this book to my new colleagues when they come, as the phrase goes in Atlantic Canada, from away. In the book, there is a chapter entitled How Canadian Politics Works. When you turn the page, you simply find two words: it doesn't. Now, this was a book written in 2007, and since then I'm happy to report that despite whatever quirks or gaffes could lead the authors to make that joke, our relatively small but still sovereign and stable social democracy is very much working. I have been asked to speak about how Baptists in the Canadian context have discerned difficult issues. And as I said, this is at the denominational level, but also we have to talk about congregational experiences too. All in 20 minutes, which I know I know I can't include everything, but my immediate knee-jerk answer might sound very similar to the writers of the book, How to Be Canadian. We don't. I can tell you cases where congregations have very stale business meetings, where discernment often does not happen because of a clericalized mentality that looks to the pastor to do everything, Or I could tell you of instances where pastors and congregations have essentially outsourced discernment to our head office or simply relied on centers of theological education like Acadia Divinity College to do the intellectual work of discernment essentially for them. All of that reiterates just why Dr. Moriarty's work is so needed. There are, however, other instances, and the situation is obviously much more complicated. As I will attempt to describe in my time here with you today, I want to reflect on how Canadian Baptists have been discerning or attempted to discern very difficult matters. Three in particular, as I said, I will recount them in brief, namely women in ministry, decolonization, and same-sex marriages. When I look at Dr. Ruth Moriarty's work, I see resonances which I will point out. And namely, you'll hear a big theme of the sharing of stories. And so let's look at the first one, women in ministry. The first female Baptist minister ordained in Canada was Muriel Spurgeon in 1947 and Josephine Kinley Moore in the Atlantic Convention in 1954. And by the way, Canadian Baptists are organized into four larger autonomous regional conventions that are comprised of then smaller associations, and they share an international missions arm called Canadian Baptist Ministries. Now, when these ordinations occurred, the decisions were obviously controversial and contested at the time, and women who felt called to ministry faced tremendous barriers and still do. In 1987, the Atlantic Convention voted to affirm the right of individual churches to call women as their pastors. In 2009, a prominent pastor, Reverend Hugh McNally, founded the Atlantic Society for Biblical Equality, which I and Melody are on the board of. This, along with groups like Atlantic Baptist Women, have become a space of scriptural discussion, education, story sharing, and support. And so there's a kind of parachurch place of discernment happening here. Since then, the culture of the denomination has shifted enough that we have seen the appointment of the first female president of our college, Anna Robbins, in 2019. Jen Lau became the first female executive director of CBM in 2020. And the vote to call the first female executive minister of the Atlantic Convention, Renee McVicker, in 2023. And that was a vote that received, I believe it was 96% support. And if you're there that day, you would see it was a truly spirit-filled moment as the vote was announced and people spontaneously started praising God and singing worship at the floor of the assembly. I think that is one of the true kind of spiritual moments of congregational life happening that way. This signaled a tremendous shift from past decades. And this is often, however, at the level of clergy, who are theologically educated and who serve as delegates to the assembly and its agencies. The local church is much more varied. And for that, I want to tell the story of my own church. The past year, I had the privilege of being on the search committee of my church, Billtown United Baptist Church, where I also serve as deacon. We called our church's first female pastor. When the senior pastor moved into being the regional representative for CBM, the director of worship and youth expressed desire to take up the pastoral role and leave her day job as a teacher. When we received her application, no one on the search committee opposed women in ministry, but we were unsure whether the church would be fully on board. Now, ours being a farm church, it's a rural area and so culturally conservative, but since it is small, it wasn't hard to ask around. What we heard, I think, reflects a bit of what Dr. Moriarty talks about. We heard stories, how a previous search committee years ago called a female pastor, and the congregational vote was so split, the pastor declined to come. We also heard stories of when the church opened up their deacons board to women years ago, how these women were treated, and now those matriarchs of the church found out of a potential candidate being female, and they were just not about to let another woman be treated the way they were. Beyond that, then, when the congregational vote occurred, the membership simply said things like, "We know this person. We know she has the gifting." While these shifts, both at denomination and congregational levels, were less, and particularly at the denominational level, was the result less of a formal discernment process in the denomination and more the result of a fierce tenacity of women to affirm their call, as well as the cumulative effect of theological education amongst pastors and various decisions to uphold liberty of conscience. You can see there's been a kind of slow wisdom occurring. And I want to signal that it's through the work of memory. For instance, as I saw at Billtown, while the church was still quite conservative and firmly evangelical in its beliefs about Scripture, when it came down to it, the decision was less about exegesis of texts like 1 Timothy 2 and more about an intuitive theological rationale based on the community's memories of how people had been treated and thus how they ought to be treated, and a current experience of a person's vocation and gifting. And I believe that is very biblical, but it's not often articulated that way. To use a phrase last week, the divine gut, I believe that was correct in this instance. However, since then, we've had these discussions as people brought up, what about this passage or that passage? And so we've seen this need for ongoing explanation and reinforcement. You might call that, as Anselm called, faith-seeking understanding, or we might say something more like communal faith-seeking understanding. And I think that reflects very similar conversations across many of our churches. Now, a lot more I can say about that, but let me go on to decolonization. In general, Canadians have become increasingly aware of the atrocities of the residential schools, where our government forced Indigenous peoples onto reserves using the Indian Act, but then separated Indigenous children from their families to forcibly attend these schools, where abuse was rampant, and somewhere it's estimated that around 5,000 children died over the years. These schools were largely ran by churches, and Baptists in Canada were largely not formally a part of the residential schools, but did support the values that motivated them and ignored the government when it took those actions. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded its work in 2015, the executive director of CBM at the time, Terry Smith, issued an apology the next year. The apology was criticized by some as an overstep, that it didn't represent how some of the more conservative churches in Canada felt about colonization and Christianity. In response, the CBAC Council assembled a working group. The working group proposed a statement and plan adopting Terry Smith's apology, and as well as the TRC's calls to action and a set of suggested practices. You can read about these on the CBAC website. The proposal was approved at the Assembly in 2019 by unanimous vote. And since then, Acadia Divinity College has been particularly active in conversations and the implementation of what decolonized education might entail. However, as we saw in the conflict between settler and Indigenous fisheries here in Nova Scotia in 2020, it was over treaty fishing rights, where then a building was burned down in a mob. Literally, the flames of racism quickly fanned when livelihoods appeared to be threatened. Same with other land claims occurring in New Brunswick, as well as on the West Coast, where oil companies want to build pipelines around Indigenous lands. And so what does this mean? I think we see here a partial or incomplete ongoing discernment process. You can see this was in many ways sparked by a kind of top-down inception, beginning with Terry Smith's apology, but then the adoption of a statement at the recommendation of a working group. The unanimous decision speaks of how all the delegates really did agree to decolonization, at least in theory, or at least have an admission that the residential schools were a tremendous evil that we need to rectify. However, now we're struggling to live out what that commitment means and all that it implies. And so we have to be resolved to live out our commitment. Here, the processes of slow wisdom at a community level are vital. And what could that look like? In the fall, the college invited an Indigenous elder to lead people through what is called the blanket exercise. The participants were asked to stand on a blanket representing Indigenous land that was slowly rolled back as the history was retold. And participants were asked to sit down, representing those who had been killed at different points. Participants could see this representation of indigenous land and people get reduced to a shadow of its former self. And then the participants were invited to engage in a talking circle, which is an indigenous communal sharing practice. It struck me that when we were doing this talking circle, this non-hierarchical practice of storytelling, lament, and it culminated in prayer, that this indigenous practice could help Baptists be better Baptists. If, of course, we are willing to let go of our Western cultural senses of superiority. Again, slow wisdom is about hearing stories, and it is going to be particularly crucial on this matter. And perhaps we can adopt this creative this practice of communal sharing in our churches to further this conversation that I think is so needed. Um, let's go on to the last contentious issue that I will talk about, again, very briefly, and that is same-sex marriages. In 2003, an Ontario Court of Appeal ruled the current laws restricting marriage were unconstitutional, which led to the national laws changing in 2005 with the Civil Marriages Act. This caused something of a scare amongst Baptist conventions, and there was a worry that the government would coerce ministers to officiate marriages that they did not believe in. This scare motivated the conventions to take a uniform stance, although there were less binding resolutions made before this. Now, resolutions were passed not only reaffirming traditional stances on marriage, but stating that pastors who performed same-sex marriage would face decredentialing. However, since then, Canadian culture and Canadian Christianity has shifted massively. A number of statistics place the support for legal recognition of same-sex marriages at around 80%, which is significant given that 53% of Canadians adhere to Christianity. In 2014, I can only say this is how it played out in a congregation I pastored. When I pastored First Baptist Church of Sudbury, which is a part of the Canadian Baptists in the Ontario and Quebec Convention. And I'll say I left my previous Baptist denomination after being given an ultimatum over my views of women in ministry. And I didn't say that in my for that earlier section, but that's what led me to the Canadian Baptists. I started pastoring this small, struggling, historic Baptist church in the far north. In the first few deacons meetings, I realized that there were ongoing questions about how to respond pastorally to LGBTQ individuals, and that was the letters back then. More have been added. The leadership team and I read Generous Spaciousness by Wendy Vanderval Gritter. We used her small group material in our small groups, and when we listened to stories, told our own experiences, prayed, and studied different scriptures. Wendy came and we had nights of discussion and sharing. One distinct impression I got was that many of our senior congregants were, to my surprise, some of the most adamant on inclusion. They told the story of how one of my predecessors had a child beloved by the church family who came out as gay, and the church turned on this individual. And these members remembered that. It was the older folks rather, who said things like, I don't know what to think about this, but I just believe nobody should be treated that way in God's house. We are all God's children and we need to treat each other that way. Meanwhile, others were horrified. And after having these discussions, I saw that people had left the church. The church had a gay individual who started reattending when we started having these talks, and they specifically requested what our position would be. And so the deacons and I crafted a policy acknowledging that there was diversity within our church. And so we would attempt to walk a middle way. We stated, biblically, we did not see the denouncements of Scripture to be similar to the love that same-sex couples express, and we would not discriminate on a person's sexual orientation or convictions about same-sex relationships in regards to our membership and fellowship. But we also felt that it best reflected our community to uphold the denomination's ban on performing same-sex marriages. That policy, with everyone in our congregation assembled, that policy proposal passed unanimously. And yet, oddly, some of the people there, I noticed, left after, which was interesting. Despite this, First Baptist grew over the next few years into what I would call a messy mosaic of people. And I wrote a tract called Clarity is Charity, which sought to outline what the different perspectives were and what the real issues were and how we could have gospel-centered unity. The denomination heard about this in Ontario, and I was asked to help mediate in arguments between pastors of the conservative coalition of churches and pastors of the more progressive coalition of churches on a few occasions. In 2018, Acadia Divinity College hired me as assistant professor of theology, and in 2021, there was a survey of the denominational leaders in the Atlantic, and it was on different controversial subjects. Results indicated that a majority view is traditionalist in regarding to same-sex relationships. However, shockingly, which was negligible or just not there in previous surveys, a portion, 20% of respondents, were supportive of change of the denomination's stance. Meanwhile, when polled on whether a 2S LGBTQI plus person should be prevented from being a church member, 47% responded in disagreement or strong disagreement, with only 36% in agreement or strong agreement. And the rest indicated they were unsure. And also, regardless, 89% of the respondents desired resources for dialogue. And so in 2022, I was asked to be a part of the working groups for the Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada on sexual orientation and gender identity, the SOGI group for short. For this, we conducted interviews and focus groups. We have written modular seminars for congregations that are currently in the process of approval. And I've written a long paper that attempts to present and analyze the core theological issues in the debate over same-sex marriages, which has just been published with the Perspectives of Religious Studies journal. In doing so, I hope these provide resources that allow for better congregational discernment and discussion. And as you can imagine, and some of you don't need to imagine this at all, this process continues to be bumpy. The process, you could simply say, needs slow wisdom. It needs deep, honest prayer, both personally and corporately, that give voice to the complicated doubts, curiosities, fears, and hurts that topics of sexuality can trigger. It needs the kind of prayer that affirms that we as Baptists believe in soul liberty, and thus have this deep responsibility of honesty before God. And that reflects then in honesty to each other. This process requires listening and hearing. There are so many harmful labels that get shouted in these debates. But these stereotypes, in my experience, very quickly get dispelled when you actually sit with a person and hear their story, their desire to follow Christ, to wrestle with the scripture, to love as Christ wants them to love. The hardest part of this process has been realizing that the Baptist family is diverse and how we construct a doctrine of marriage from Scripture is complicated. The denomination has a kind of majoritarian default, and yet we are far from true consensus that Dr. Moriarty and soon to be Dr. Jaspers has talked about. And yet we have to, as many of us have said, we need to hold to us as family. Some say about family, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. I think that's true of the Baptist family too. I deeply believe that the only way forward is to learn to listen to each other as family and see what the Spirit will do with that. I deeply appreciate the writings on education by the Quaker thinker Parker Palmer. He reminds us that the soul is shy. Which he means by that is that we need to culminate spaces of mutual acceptance and reciprocity and non-coercion as spaces essential to the kind of vulnerable truth-telling these difficult matters require. Palmer notes in his books that important truths of the social life, of human social life, can only be expressed in seemingly paradoxical statements as we bring together complex facets of our experience. And I have seen those in my work, which coalesce with the principles of slow wisdom. They might go as follows. I have learned that when it comes to prayer, that embracing the gray, the questions, the laments, that only in forsaking certainty can one actually find clarity. I have learned that it is only in listening to others, vulnerably, fallibly, that one can find oneself, what one truly is, who we truly are and believe. I've learned that by forsaking power as a means of controlling others, and in turn hearing and recognizing another, this is the only way actually to be persuasive. I have learned that recognizing diversity is the only way to build consensus and unity. The variety of the body, oddly, actually reminds us of the centrality of Christ. I have learned that being patient is the only way actually to bring about immediate radical change. I've learned that the best way to build a church or denomination is not to be motivated by institutional preservation. Of course, like many things in the Christian life, the only way disciples and churches can only have a future is by dying to self. And so, whether in discerning women's ordination, decolonization, and same sex marriages, uh, my fuller reflection on this matter, still brief as it may be, is not that Canadian Baptists don't do it, but rather we desperately need to learn how to do it better. And so, thank you.
Thank you very much, Spencer, for your words. I will say that there will be an opportunity later to ask questions of the panelists, but for now, we're going to turn things over to Gale Richards for her response to both papers. So thank you, Gale.
Thank you. So two very rich papers to respond to. So thank you for the opportunity. I guess I start by saying I'm based in the UK context, which is where Dr. Moriarty did her research that led to the concept of slow wisdom and the 6 elements that she has outlined, studying Baptist churches in England, where I too am based. And so I guess I start by saying that I affirm her findings and sort of say those elements I agree are very helpful as we think about discernment processes in the wider church. Now, listening to Derek's paper, the first one, I found myself asking a number of questions. It's fascinating. I'm someone that's been heavily involved ecumenically as well as in Baptist circles, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. So it's fascinating to hear the paper. And the first question that came to my mind were, how were the members of the Baptist delegates or participants in the commission for this Baptist and Roman Catholic Form and Dialogue, how were they selected? And of course, the assumption in my mind is that the Baptist members would have been carefully selected so that they were well informed about Baptist discernment processes and had a good level of experience of them. Similarly, I found myself asking the question, how was the agenda for the commission's time together set? Again, I assume carefully. So there was opportunity for a right balance between opportunities to discuss theological matters in a space that was saturated by prayer, as well as an opportunity to have conversation around eating meals. So you didn't horridly have to, devour your meal, but that space, that time for conversation. And again, in deciding who would lead prayers to ensure that they are sufficiently formed in Baptist identity and understanding and the way they do that. So thinking about that wider ecumenical setting and discernment processes and some of that careful selection that I imagine was part of that process, it made me think about what about in our own Baptist, regional, national, international gatherings? How do we prepare participants in those spaces to understand and engage well in Baptist discernment practices? There are huge variations locally as to how discerning the mind of Christ together is valued or practiced. And my sense is there needs to be better acknowledgement of the need to prepare people in those translocal spaces to discern the mind of Christ together well at association, conventional union levels, whichever space we're talking about. I think there's often a lack of acknowledgement of how people don't have those skills. And as they're coming as representatives, what does that mean? And how does that then shape what we're seeking to do? In listening to the second paper, thinking about the Canadian context and, 3 very meaty examples of discernment processes around contentious issues, I found myself thinking about the Baptist Union of Great Britain context and our own journeys of addressing those 3 matters: women in ministry, decolonisation, and same-sex marriages. Our context here in Britain is slightly different in the sense that women were recognised as ministers much earlier, so 1918. But as we reflect on how that decision was made, it's much more pragmatic, a pragmatic decision rather than any formal or thick discernment process. It was more a case of leaving it to the autonomy of the local church. So just thinking of the wording of our National Baptist Union Council Committee in 1926, when it actually began to sort of grapple with the fact that a church had called a woman to be its minister. And one of the words in that statement simply read, "It would be contrary to Baptist belief and practice to make sex a bar to any kind of Christian service, as a local church has the right to call its pastor." So, as I say, that no real discernment process grappling with the real issues. And so there was no detailed theological statement around the issue of women in ministry in the Baptist Union of Great Britain until 1966. There's quite a gap. And that was when it was one of the committees of our National Baptist Union Council within the union who offered a document called Women in Service of the Denomination, which was later published in 1967. In thinking about decolonization, my mind turned to, again, our National Baptist Union Council, a key discernment body that has representatives from the different members that make up that body. So representatives of the churches, the ministers, our colleges, and our regional Baptist associations. And so in 2007, our National Baptist Union Council discerned that it was right to make an apology with regard to British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. That was followed up by some research, because part of the apology statement that was made was a commitment to the Baptist Union becoming more culturally inclusive and addressing some of the racism within the union itself. And so the research that followed the apology being made in 2007 focused on how barriers around race, culture, ethnicity could be addressed. And it came up with some recommendations, which were again discerned to be adopted in our National Council in March 2011. With regards to same-sex marriages, we had a consultation 2023, 2024, where churches, ministers were able to complete a questionnaire to share their sense of whether or not there should be any changes to our ministerial recognition rules to allow a minister to be in a same-sex marriage and remain on we have an accredited list of ministers. So thinking about those three areas and the processes of discernment that took place within it, again, referring back to the slow wisdom elements that we might think about, were they present and to what extent? I think the answer from many people would be it's debatable. It really depends on from whose perspective you're looking back at those processes from. I do know that certainly with regard to the apology, I wasn't present at those discernment processes of the Baptist Union Council, but I know people referred to it as feeling quite painful at times, very difficult to hear things that were being said. So there's definitely some listening and the sense of prophetic voice being present. So those from black and brown backgrounds speaking about their experiences, their embodied lived experiences coming through. There were references to people changing their mind as to whether or not an apology should be issued or not in that space. Again, I wasn't present at the Baptist Union Council's discernment processes when the decision was taken not to change our ministerial recognition rules around same-sex marriages and ministers. But again, some people would say they found the processes very painful. Some would say they found it too rushed. Others it took too long. So again, I think as we reflect on the effectiveness of these discernment processes, I think we need to be conscious of the lens through which we are observing, listening, or as to the effectiveness of them. I think there's a very personalized dimension to it. As I reflect on where we have gone following these decisions that have been made through these discernment processes, I think that also perhaps gives us a clue as to how effective they were. Thinking about the apology and the journey recommendations that followed, I found myself reflecting last year on another research project we had, Project Violet, which was focused on how structural obstacles around women ministers that are currently facing within the union might be addressed. Again, an extensive research project, and our council, Baptist Union Council, again agreed various recommendations for change. But one of the interesting reflections was that the various researchers involved in that process and the reports that they delivered did not make mention of the apology or the journey. There's a sense of how, to what extent were those decisions owned at the grassroots level? And one might say, to what extent were the representatives on our Baptist Union Council actually representative of the wider churches at the grassroots level? And so we might say our council discerned a way forward in these areas, but was it really discerning the mind of Christ as to do with our whole union? So I think we have some challenges to think about what we mean about discernment at the wider level, whose voices are represented in the room, and what happens after those representatives go back to their relevant places. Certainly, I know with the apology and the journey recommendations, a number of the ministers that were there as representatives, when they went back to their relevant places and other people in other parts of our union, the work of discerning at the local level, at the local church, did not happen. And so when I say discernment at the local level, I mean reflecting on the statements and how they might be adopted. What also was discovered is a level of pushback. So I think to conclude, it's complex, and I think our two papers that have been presented have very much demonstrated that we are very diverse as Baptists. And I think there are bigger questions as to which, my time is limited here, as to the extent to which in some of our regional associations, for example, again, thinking of one of the papers, the reference to church members deferring to the pastor and not wanting to do the work of discernment. You see that also happening in our regional associations, where the regional minister are expected to get on with things. So hopefully some helpful reflections that will help with our discussions in small groups.
Thank you so much, Gale. I appreciate the thoughtful reflections of all of our presenters. And I'll give Derek and Spencer a chance for brief responses to Gale if they would like. Starting with Derek, do you have anything you'd like to mention?
Just a few words just to briefly respond to Gale's questions. And her intuition is exactly right, that there is a carefulness to the selection of commission members for an ecumenical dialogue commission. Largely that comes from each body at the top level, if it's national or international. And usually it's people that do have some experience reflecting on these things, maybe even participating in previous dialogues, even if not in this particular exchange. The agenda, though, is a little bit more complicated. It is set by a team within the commission before the dialogue starts, but often with input from the executives from each body who are not present in the process. And sometimes that's one of the rubs. There are some places where there's some friction, and some of that friction is when the executive ends up back in the conversation at the end. And so sometimes there can be some things that were talked about with some long, patient conversations that the executive doesn't really understand how that happened, and that can produce some friction even within one particular denomination. Leading prayers is a little bit more free form in some ways, that it's who's available, who's willing to say yes. And that I think provides a little bit more of that diversity. Sometimes it's, the prayers can be led by the liturgical occasion. Sometimes it can be led by practices of different Baptist communities, if it's a Baptist leading it, or maybe a different order if it's somebody from a Catholic tradition, in the case of the two examples that I used. But I do think preparation, and her point is exactly right, that there's perhaps when we move to the translocal setting, we don't realize just how much preparation is needed for this kind of discernment. And so that there's some skill there that maybe even is different than the local congregation, and it may require us to think about what are the particular ways to cultivate those skills. So I appreciate Gale's comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Spencer, anything you'd like to say in response?
I don't think I did. I didn't hear a question from Gale in her.
No, you don't have to. If there's nothing that you'd like to bring up, we can. That's okay.
I was just going to say, not mentioned in my paper, but there is the UK statement, the courage to be Baptist, that I'm sure many of you know about. I use it in my classes, and I've recommended at our working groups as a really good example of kind of this listening and recognition. And maybe some of you have more complex thoughts on that, but I've often joked that if we were to have our own statement, we might call it the courage to converse. Because it's so easy to cite Baptist identity, namely around autonomy, and as Gale kind of said, there can be a kind of pragmatic appeal to liberty that doesn't actually resolve the matter, that doesn't engage in the kind of deep listening and hearing of sincerity, and that kind of wrestling that all of these matters desperately need. And so to say, yes, we have autonomy, but now we need to actually talk. That's a whole lot harder. And so that would maybe be my thought on the matter. The other bit of it was one thing that I deeply appreciated about the talk last week was the clarification that consensus doesn't necessarily mean a majority vote. And maybe that's something that we can just simply recognize as pastors, that getting a majority vote doesn't mean consensus. And while a lot of our polities are geared towards those kinds of resolutions, we would be out of step with the spirit if we simply saw a majority vote as solving it. That doesn't deal well, Derek said this as well, of hearing marginalized voices and having that deeper sense of recognition. And that's, again, I think just so badly needed. And I'll just say that. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our presenters for really provoking lots of thought, and I think we'll have lots of conversation about this. I hope this time has been meaningful, helpful, life-giving to you, and we wish you all the best in your own contexts as you go forward to discern the mind of Christ together.